All right, welcome back. This is our last session for Roger That this afternoon. We have with us this afternoon Dr. Dwayne A. Dwayne works for the National Academies of, where he has overseen studies on the protection of Earth from hazardous asteroids, the exploration of the solar system, the development of large space telescopes, and the size of the NASA astronaut corps. He has a PhD in political science from the George Washington University and has worked in several space policy related jobs over the past 2 decades, with brief stints working as an Air Force contractor as well as an historian for the Congressional Budget Office. He served as a consultant to the Institute for Defense Analysis, Science and Technology Policy Institute on issues such as the Russian space program and NASA's Human Mars plans. He was an investigator for the Columbia Accident Investigation Board. He writes frequently on the history and politics of the American space program, particularly military space projects and the collection of intelligence information using satellites and other systems. So without further ado, Dr. Dwayne A.
Good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me. You're all familiar with this, and actually once you get out of this meeting and you start looking at the news again, you'll see that this issue is now back in the news. The United States apparently shot down one of these balloons over Alaska a few hours ago. So this story continues, and for those of you who may have not looked at the news in the past week or so, this is the Chinese spy balloon that mesmerized the nation last week and was finally shot down off the coast of South Carolina. This balloon was operating at about 60,000 feet, and what it was doing most likely was it was listening in for communications. And it turns out that balloons used for observation and used for spying is something that goes back a really long time. And let me see if I can, there we go. This photograph here was taken during the Civil War, and it was actually, this location is actually about a mile from where I'm sitting right now. This is in Falls Church, Virginia, and which is a suburb of Washington, D.C. It's only about 10 miles outside of the city. And it's a fascinating story about how observation balloons were used in the Civil War. And one of the uses was, if you're familiar with that period of history, Washington was essentially a surrounded city. It was in enemy territory for quite a long period during the war, and there was concern that the city might actually be invaded early on. And so one of the things that the Union Army did was they would go out, like I said, about 10 miles outside of the city, and they would float these observation balloons. They would do this, generally they would put one up in early in the morning, and there would be 1 or 2 observers underneath the balloon, and from a few hundred feet up, these observers could then look out farther out into Virginia and see if there was an army that was massing, that was on its way into the city. And the way it generally worked was that their observation limit was about the distance that an army could march in a day. So they would float up in this balloon in the morning, and they'd observe and if they didn't see an army, they knew that Washington was safe from attack for another day, because nobody could reach the city that quickly. These observations were actually reported in local newspapers in Washington, D.C. at the time. It's really kind of a fascinating little story there. But essentially, people would get up in the morning and look at their local newspaper, and it would say, no enemy forces seen outside the city today. So you got another day. But observation balloons go back, even further back beyond the Civil War. Excuse me. But they were used up through the up early into the 1900s, and then we started flying aircraft. and aircraft were used for observation. Balloons were still used for observation early in the 1900s. And of course, there were reconnaissance aircraft used during World War II. And then with the advent of the Cold War, after the end of World War II, the United States became concerned that it did not know much about what was going on inside the Soviet Union. And that led to the development of this, which was a high altitude spy plane known as the U-2. And the U-2 was capable of operating at very high altitudes, above 70,000 feet. And that the belief was that this would allow the aircraft to fly above any potential defenses in the Soviet Union. And actually at the very beginning of the use of this aircraft, there was the belief that the Soviet Union might not even be able to spot the aircraft, that it would be above the effective altitude of their radar systems, which turned out to be false. Now, the plane entered service in the mid-1950s. It made very few flights over the Soviet Union. It made a number of flights over Eastern Europe, the occupied territories in those countries like East Germany, Romania, Hungary. Mainly, I think the flights were over East Germany. It made a few flights over the Soviet Union, and it carried this, which was a very interesting camera. If you look, excuse me, you look at the lower right, that's that object down there, that is where the lens projected. And you can see that it was mounted on a ring, and that lens would actually rotate. It could rotate back and forth, and that allowed the plane to fly at very high altitudes and to take pictures from left to right, and cover a lot of territory as it flew over the vast empty spaces of the Soviet Union that we knew almost nothing about. So the U-2 proved very effective, but it was a really provocative system. We knew right from the beginning that as soon as this thing was flying, that it was a threat to the Soviet Union. They were going to try and shoot it down. And President Eisenhower, who authorized every single one of those flights personally, he was very concerned, and he said to his aides that if the Soviets were doing this to us, he would consider it an act of war. So there was a search right from the beginning of that program, of the U-2 program, to come up with something better, to come up with a system that could replace it and not be as provocative. The U-2 was able to take some pretty good pictures, and here's a photograph from 1957 of a nuclear reactor site in the Soviet Union. There were a lot of locations within the Soviet Union that we knew almost nothing about, and so any photographs at all were very valuable. And people who looked at these photographs and understand that the photos I'm showing you are degraded in quality, and what the analysts were looking at were better. They got better resolution out of them. They were looking at them with microscopes, for instance. Excuse me. But they could get a lot of information out of things like this. One of the problems, however, was also that the plane could only fly a limited flight path and could only photograph the things that were underneath it. So that limited the amount of photography that they could gather on each mission. So starting really after World War II, immediately after World War II, and then continuing out throughout the 1950s, there were a number of studies of how could we take camera systems higher, and could we take them put a camera, fly it in orbit in a satellite, and take photographs that way. Now, these studies were done within the U.S. Air Force, and there was always this competition between in terms of desires of the requirements of what you wanted to be able to do. and the limitations of the existing rockets at the time. And it was not until the Atlas rocket, the Atlas ICBM came along, that it really became feasible to start designing a system that could actually fly into orbit and take photographs. And the very early studies, they were looking at the possibility of a television camera and using a TV camera to look down and then to beam those images back over a radio link. The problem is television is a very low resolution camera system. It's not going to give you a lot. So by the late 1950s, you may remember that Sputnik, the Soviet Union, launched Sputnik into orbit in October of 1957. So in 1958, there was suddenly an influx of money going into various military space systems. And that led to money going into a program that was initially called WS-117L, which stood for Weapon System 117L. And WS-117L had 3 different components, and one was called Samos, one was called Midas, and the other one was called Discoverer. And the plan was to launch these out of Vandenberg Air Force Base in California, which is on the central coast of California. It's now called Vandenberg Space Force Base. You get a sense from the picture at the top there of a little bit what it looks like. It's very different than Cape Canaveral at the coast on Florida. It's colder. There's not a lot of, you don't have swamps and you don't have orange trees, and it's windy and foggy. It's very beautiful, but it's a lot more rugged than what you get out in Florida. But the benefit of that California launch site is that you can launch rockets directly south and put them in orbit over the poles. And that allows you, as the satellite circles from pole to pole, the Earth rotates underneath it, and you can take photographs of a lot more territory as you go around the Earth. So the initial plan was this for reconnaissance was this program called Samos. Samos was an Air Force program, and I'm going to get to some of the distinctions here. This talk is not really about the organizations or the people that worked on these programs, but there are some important factors to know about the history there that's relevant. When I mentioned the U-2 spy plane earlier on, that was a CIA program. That was not an Air Force program. And there was this constant back and forth discussion within the very high levels of the US government about whether reconnaissance should be a civilian, meaning the CIA, a civilian mission, or a military mission, meaning primarily the Air Force. And the Air Force took the early lead on this and was working on Samos. Samos was going to do, the initial part of Samos was to do radio transmission of the photographs. But Samos was not, and the Air Force also talked about what it was doing. Now, it didn't go into detail on the technical specifications, but the Air Force admitted that they wanted to operate reconnaissance satellites and take photographs of the Soviet Union. And that did not go over well within the Eisenhower administration, because there was concern that this was provocative. And if we talked openly about what we were doing, it might prompt a response from the Soviet Union, and we didn't want that. So the early program was Samos. Samos ran into a number of problems, technical problems, and it had some severe limitations because of how it took the photographs and how it sent them back to the ground. So the concept was that the satellite would go over the poles. It would take its images over Russia, over the Soviet landmass, and then as it came back over the United States, it would beam those images down to the ground, where they would be reassembled at a ground station, and then photo analysts could look at them. But one of the problems was that you were talking about a very low bandwidth system here, and most people today have broadband, they have very fast internet. But if you remember back to the days of slower internet speeds, and you tried to download really large files over them, you knew how long that could take. For instance, it was the same thing with satellites. That was the same concern, was that they could not send a lot of images over this limited link, and the quality was not going to be very good. So that led to, there was another system that was under development that was intended to be initially an interim system. It was only supposed to last a few years. And the cover story for that was, it was an engineering scientific program called Discoverer. It was going to use a smaller rocket, and the program was, at least the Discoverer program was public at the time. It was acknowledged, and you could go back and you could look at newspapers from 1958, and you can see references to Discoverer. And this gives you a sense of the size of Discoverer. And Discoverer had a re-entry vehicle at the nose, and you can see it's that rounded thing at the in the two bottom pictures, and then inside of that rounded thing was a container that they generally referred to as a bucket, because you can see that it looks kind of like a bucket, and that contained equipment. Here are some workers putting together the upper stage for one of these Discoverer launches out at Vandenberg. And this is probably around 1959. And officially, Discoverer was supposed to carry mice and monkeys. And you can see a rather unhappy little monkey on the bottom right. And at the left was a little shrine that was made to several mice that died while one of the test vehicles was sitting on the ground awaiting launch. They apparently overheated within the capsule and died. That happened in early 1959. Now that was the official cover story. The reality was that Discoverer was carrying this, which was a camera system, and it was called Corona. Corona, now, even though the launch was being managed by the Air Force and the Discoverer program was being managed by the Air Force, the camera system that was inside of it was being managed by the Central Intelligence Agency. And Corona was a really clever system at the time. And the way it worked was, it actually rotated the camera inside of the spacecraft, and that that allowed the camera to sweep over a large area of ground and record the image on a long strip of film. Now, I actually laughed when I thought about making this presentation, because some people watching may not know what film is anymore, because it's not that common. But film is a flexible material. Usually it's a flexible material. Think of it as a long, thin strip of plastic onto which there are chemicals that have deposited. And when you expose it to light, it records an image. This is a vastly oversimplified description. But film was invented in the 1800s, and there are people who still use film today. I would caution you to not think of film as an old technology, because it is, it's kind of like if we say, well, the wheel is an old technology, but we still use it. The wheel is still very, very valuable piece of technology. Film was a way of storing data, of storing imagery, and it was tremendously powerful. In fact, in terms of technology, it's only been within, say, the past decade or so that we have digital systems that can record more data than film systems. So film really up until very recently in some applications has been more powerful than the best digital systems that are available. So the way Corona worked was it exposed an image over a long, thin piece of film, and that could record a lot of imagery. Early on, it wasn't all that great. This is the first reconnaissance photo taken from space on the right there. All you can see is a little thin strip, and that's a runway. But when this image was taken, when this first mission was successful, it was really important because if you know nothing about large portions of territory within the Soviet Union, and suddenly you now have photographs that show that there's a city there, or there's a missile base, or there is an army facility, that is even if the photographs don't show much, the fact that you suddenly know that there is something there and you did not know that before is really important. The film was exposed in orbit. It was wrapped up around a reel that was contained within that bucket that I mentioned earlier. That re-entry vehicle that would pop off of the front of the satellite. It would re-enter the atmosphere. It would come down. The heat shield would pop off. It would deploy a parachute, and then an airplane would come along and it would grab it out of the middle of the air. I can't remember the altitude, something like 15,000 feet. Now this seems kind of crazy, but it turns out it was very effective. The pilots trained a lot, and then they almost never missed. And so it became a really successful way of gathering up the photographs, catching them in the air, and then returning them to land where they could be processed, and then people could finally look at them. Here's an example. This is a training flight where they're over the desert. This is probably over the Mojave Desert at Edwards Air Force Base. And what they would do is one plane would fly at a very high altitude, and they'd push one of these capsules out of the back hatch, and another plane flying lower at a lower altitude would come along and it would grab it out of the air. The early Corona missions suffered a lot of failures. They had 12 failures in a row. And normally, today, if we have a few failures in a row, they cancel a program. Back then, they kept having failure after failure. They kept figuring out what went wrong each time and fixing that, so they never had the same failure twice. But they were having all these failures, and people would go to President Eisenhower and they'd say, "Do you want to cancel the program?" And he said, "No, it is way too important. We need to keep doing this." And so on the 13th mission, they had a success. And here's the engineers who built it. They were having a party to celebrate at a local hotel, and somebody pushed the boss into the pool, and then they all jumped in afterwards. So they were very happy at what they had accomplished. And this was in August of 1960. So Corona continued flying. It actually, as I mentioned, the first success was in 1960. The last Corona mission was in 1972. The images were not very high quality. They were what we would consider low resolution today. But they still, because they covered a lot of territory, they saw a lot of things that we did not know were there. And that was really important. That could be quite valuable. And in this case, a Corona mission spotted this construction out in the desert in China. And the people who looked at this photograph knew instantly what this was, and they said China is preparing to detonate an atomic bomb. And we weren't sure that they were going to do that until we saw this picture. And actually, President Lyndon Johnson decided to go public with this information. He did not say we saw it with a spy satellite, but they put out an announcement beforehand that said China is going to detonate an atomic bomb. And that was done to kind of take away some of the surprise that China wanted to achieve. So, that was demonstrated some of the early value of these satellites. Now, Corona got bigger. They added more cameras. They added more film. They went from 1 reentry vehicle to 2 reentry vehicles. The system, you can see here, when they had 2 cameras, one camera would look forward, one camera would look aft. They would image the same territory, but from a slightly different angle. And then on the ground, afterwards, people could look at those 2 images and they could take measurements off of those images. And that would provide the height of objects. So if you saw a rocket sitting on a launch pad, you could actually measure how tall that rocket was by using these angles. And, it's essentially, it's geometry, really, how to figure out angles based upon existing the data that you have. So, as I mentioned, Corona continued through operating through 1972. If you were listening to Asif Siddiqui talking earlier about the Soviets' lunar program, Corona provided photographs that indicated that the Soviet Union had a lunar program. What you can see on the left, that little white sliver there is an N-1 moon rocket sitting on its launch pad. What you can see on the right is you can see 2 launch pads. Those are really at the center of the image. And you'll notice that the one over on the right seems to have a lot of dark splotches on the ground. Well, that's because that rocket blew up. It got a few hundred feet up off the ground. It failed. It fell down to the ground and exploded and scorched the earth. And the people back in Washington who looked at these photographs a few weeks later could tell that something very, devastating had happened in the Soviet lunar program. So Corona, as I mentioned, had relatively low resolution imagery. It wasn't all that, it could show big things, it couldn't show small things. And so early on in the 1960s, the people running these programs decided that they needed better photos. They needed something on the quality of the same quality as the U-2 had provided for a limited period of time. And that's where we got the KH-7, the Gambit satellite. And Gambit could take much better photographs, but it was a much smaller area that was imaged. And so the Gambit and the Corona tended to be used to complement each other. Corona would go and look out at large amounts of territory. Somebody would spot something and they'd say, oh, okay, something's going on here. And then they would later program a Gambit mission to fly over that and to take better photographs, better quality photographs of that specific thing. Here's the launch pad where Sputnik was launched and Yuri Gagarin was launched. This is a Gambit image from, I think, 1964 or so. And it provided better detail of the things that the US intelligence community was interested in. Here is a Gambit satellite at the Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. You can see, so you see that big black cylinder on the right, and you can see there's a big hole in the center of that cylinder. That's the aperture, and the camera system looked out of that. Unlike, whereas Corona scanned back and forth, Gambit just stared straight down, and they pulled the film past the exposure slit. And so you could get, they had a much larger width of film and a much larger camera system that provided that higher quality image. The film was then wrapped up into the same kind of reentry vehicle that they used for Corona, which you can see off on the left. And you can see a little bit of the gold covered bucket that's off to the left. And throughout the Cold War, things like Soviet and Chinese missile and nuclear test sites were of very great interest. And here is a Gambit photograph of another Chinese atomic weapon site. You can If you remember the one from a few slides ago that had the big circle in the desert, well, here's another big circle in the desert. But here you can also see the tower that they built, and they would put the atomic bomb at the top of this tower to test the effects from detonating it at altitude as opposed to on the ground. You can also see the shadow off to the lower right. We didn't only spy on the Soviet Union and the Chinese. Here is a Gambit photograph of a French atomic test site out in the Pacific. And here's a plutonium production site in France. So yes, the United States was taking photographs of its allies or anybody we were slightly concerned about. Now, of course, at this time, France had dropped out of NATO, and so we were not getting the best information on what they were up to. So we were looking at their defense facilities. This is the construction building for the N1 rocket, the Soviet lunar rocket. You can see at higher resolution, you can see the doors into this facility, and this is a really large building. And then at lower right is a sketch that was done for an intelligence report about this facility. So these photographs and the drawings were all at one time labeled top secret. Here's some other sketches that were made based upon the photographs that were taken. And these sketches show the construction of the launch site for the Soviet lunar program. So while the United States was operating Corona and it was operating Gambit, there was a study done saying, well, what do we really need? And the study concluded that what the intelligence community needed was a system that had the coverage, the area coverage of Corona, but the photographic resolution of the Gambit program. And so the solution was this really big satellite called Hexagon. And there's on the left is a photograph of a Hexagon satellite on top of its Titan III rocket out at Vandenberg Air Force Base. There's the satellite on the right in a test bay in California. You can see a chair sitting off to the bottom left that gives you a sense of how big this thing was. Here it is. There's during some integration testing, you can see a blurry person down at in white down at the bottom right. Gives you a sense of how big this satellite was. The Hexagon, they started work on the Hexagon in the mid-60s, and the first launch was in 1971. And the Hexagon had 2 large cameras on it and 4 large reentry vehicles. You can see the film recovery vehicles off to the left there. It also had a mapping camera that was mounted at the nose, and that was to take large format pictures that could be used to develop maps of the Soviet Union, and also they did mapping of the United States using those camera systems. Here is the Hexagon at the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force. There is one on display there. They've since moved it to a building with better lighting in it than this one. But you can see one of the the white thing in the center. That's the heat shield for one of the reentry vehicles. You can see the gold there. That's one of the buckets for that the film was wrapped in. The cameras were in the center there. Gives you another idea of the size of the spacecraft. Here's the camera designer. This guy's a friend of mine, Phil Pressel. He worked on designing the big cameras that went into the Hexagon here. And when they declassified the program in 2011, Phil was out there and telling everybody how it worked. This is a cutaway that gives you a decent sense of how everything was located within the spacecraft. The reentry vehicles off to the left. The cameras are those big black boxes in the center. and the film supply, which was on big reels. They were probably about 6 feet in diameter, and the film would run through those camera systems. The cameras would rotate back and forth, scan very large amounts of territory below, and then that film would fill up the reentry vehicles. And once it filled up the first reentry vehicle, that one would be ejected and recovered, and then they would fill up the second one, and then the third one, and so on. You get a sense once you start thinking about this is, well, what happens when they run out of film? And what really happens when they run out of film is the mission is over. So these satellites had a limited lifetime based upon what they had on board. And this schematic gives you a sense of how the satellite would fly over the Earth, and it did the same thing as the Corona did, except it filmed much more territory at a much higher resolution. And each time one of those reentry vehicles came back, it provided a tremendous amount of information. They could fly a mission and within a matter of weeks, pretty much photograph all of the territory within the Soviet Union. And that allowed them every few months to produce intelligence estimates that would say, we count X number of ICBM silos, we count Y number of bombers, we count this number of submarines. And they could be very definitive about that. The satellites were getting bigger and bigger, and they were requiring larger rockets. And this just gives you a quick overview of the early Corona is off at the left there, and then they got bigger and they got bigger, and they added the Gambit, and that was larger and required a larger rocket and a more powerful rocket. And the Gambit got a little bigger, and then the Hexagon came along, and the Hexagon was so big that the people out at Vandenberg, who were not allowed to know what the satellite was, but knew that there was a big satellite on that rocket, would call it the Big Bird. And everybody would just refer to the Big Bird, which is out there on the launch pad. And Hexagon used film like all these earlier systems. And in the mid 1970s came a new system called the Kennen, or the KH-11. And the Kennen was a digital imaging system. Here's a notional image of the Kennen. There have been no declassified images of what the satellite actually looked like, but we know the general configuration. We know that it looks like the Hubble. And the Hubble Space Telescope shared a lot of the same technology, and as well as the same contractors. And unlike the Hexagon, which had huge stores of film and a lot of moving parts and a lot of mechanical complexity, the Kennen was relatively simple. It had a big mirror, and it had an imaging system that could take images off of that mirror, and then a communication system for sending that imagery down to the Earth. This is the Hubble mirror. This might be the Hubble backup mirror. I'm not, no, this is actually the Hubble mirror because it's coded. The backup mirror was not. We know that the reconnaissance satellites that were built at this time had the same diameter mirror as the Hubble, and that was not a coincidence. That's because that's what all the manufacturers were set up to produce, was a mirror of that size. This gives you a sense of how the images, of how they use this. This is of how they would use the data in later years. Here's a before image. This is an airfield in Libya. I think this is around 2011 or so. And here's an after image. And you can see that this was a case of, I believe, the United States attack where we took out much of the remainder of the Libyan Air Force so that it could not be used in the civil war that was going on in that country. Here's a couple of other images that give you a sense of before and after of an electrical plant. Now these images here, we're talking about 12 years ago, and I'm going to get to this in a second. You may have seen this image that was tweeted out by the president back in 2019, and then about 3-4 months ago, unofficially, the image was actually released from the report that contained it. Excuse me. This is a launch site, a rocket launch site in Iran, and they had a rocket that blew up. And like we had back in the late 1960s when Corona photographed damage to a launch site in the Soviet Union, this is still something that photo analysts are always interested in seeing. You should look at the image, at the versions of this image on the internet, which are better than what you're going to see here. But it gives you a really good sense. One of the things you can see is when you look around the edge of this is you can actually see the posts for the fence line around the facility. Gives you a sense of just how powerful these modern military systems are. But it's not only the military that's using reconnaissance satellites these days. Commercial satellites, commercial imaging satellites have really been around since starting in the 1980s. They didn't really get very good until around the 2007 or so. And here's an example of a commercially available image produced by a Worldview 1 satellite back in 2007. And if you look at the upper inset, you can see there's players on that baseball field there. So you can photograph people from space, and you can see them with images that you can buy using a credit card. Anybody can buy these things. Here's another image showing Houston, Texas, and notice you can see all the windows and the cars on the road, and commercial imagery has really advanced quite a bit within the last 5-6 years or so. This is a pair of images that were taken just last week of a big parade in North Korea. And they were rolling their missiles. You can actually see in the upper left, they were rolling their missiles past big crowds. You can see the red tip missiles there. And this was taken at night, which is pretty amazing, with a commercial satellite. The companies provide a lot of these images. They put them on the internet for free. But if you want to get a specific image of a specific target at a particular time, you can order them. You go to a website and add in your details and tell them what you want. Here's another photograph. This was taken last week, shows a Falcon 9 rocket on its launch pad in Florida. Once again, this is by you can see the company at the top right, it's Maxar. And you look closely, and once again, this is all distorted because of image compression and things like that, but you can see, if you look at that water tower, you can see the struts of the water tower, you can see fence lines. And this is in color. If you want higher resolution, you'd actually use a panchromatic system, black and white, which gives you a sharper image. So they can certainly do that. If this is what they can do commercially, you can imagine what a military system is capable of doing today. That brings me back to, now, so far I've talked all about imagery, imaging satellites, photo reconnaissance. That is only one portion of intelligence collection from space. There are a bunch of other areas where we collect intelligence. And one of them is signals intelligence. And that's what the Chinese were probably doing with that balloon a week ago. Is that balloon was carrying a whole bunch of antennas, because antennas, you want a whole bunch of antennas to collect different frequencies that are being transmitted from the ground. Well, the United States has had satellites that were capable of intercepting those signals from the ground pretty much right right from the beginning. At the same time that Corona was operating, they were developing these early systems. And here's a couple of images of systems that were developed in the 1960s. The one on the upper right is called Strawman. The one on the bottom left, and Strawman was a fairly big satellite. You can see it had a lot of antennas that pointed down. The one on the left was called Tripos Susi, and it was actually pretty small. This is about the size of a suitcase. And you can see all of the antennas that are sticking out around the edges. And this satellite would spin around really fast, about 60, 70 RPM. And if you want to know how this was oriented, so this lower image at the left, imagine that the Earth is off to the right, and that and down is the direction of flight. And so this thing would be spinning around and around, and those antennas would be sweeping past the face of the Earth and gathering up signals. Both of these satellites operated in very low Earth orbit. And the problem with collecting signals in low Earth orbit is you're not over the target very long. So you probably have a collection time of maybe 15 minutes. And that's a decent amount of time for collecting radar signals. It's not decent for collecting communication signals, because what happens if you want to capture somebody talking on the phone, but they're not talking when your satellite flies overhead? So you're going to miss that conversation. So the way to solve that is to put a much bigger satellite in a very high orbit that stares down for long periods of time and can collect those communications when they occur. The United States has been able to do that since the 1970s. The Chinese may not be able to do that right now. And so if you're wondering why did they decide to float a spy balloon around, it's because that may be their best system for collecting that kind of intelligence today. But it is very primitive. It is a very limited system. And I just wanted to end on this. I could talk to you for an hour about how they use these systems, but we're running out of time. And so I'm going to end it by saying there's a whole bunch of different books. If you're interested in reading about this, reading more about this subject, you can look these up. They're all a little bit dated right now, but they're actually they're pretty good. And I would recommend that you look at any of these. So I'm going to stop with that now. And Glenn,
Okay, thank you very much, Dwayne. We've got some time for some questions here. One of the questions that we have, which I think is on a lot of people's minds, is what advantages, if any, would a spy balloon have over a spy satellite in 2023? And I think the year is important because, as you mentioned earlier, using balloons for spying is very age old. And what seems to be coming out is that China has done this earlier than just 2023. But maybe you could address that.
Yeah, so one thing to keep in mind about China is that their space program in general is about 20 to 30 years behind ours. And you can see that in, say, the civilian their civilian space program. They just recently finished construction of their space station, their civilian space station. We completed construction of that, decade and a half ago. So, and their space station doesn't have the capabilities that ours does, but that gives you a sense that their technology is behind ours by a few decades, and that's certainly true in military systems as well. My suspicion is that what they were trying to do was they were trying to get long dwell times so that they could gather up any communications that occurred over a long period of time. If they had simply put that same gear on a low Earth orbit satellite and it flew over the United States, it would cross over. But let's assume for a moment that they were interested in those missile fields out in Montana, which that's what some of the speculation has been about. It would have overflown those missile fields in like 15 minutes. Well, What if nobody's transmitting during those 15 minutes? Whereas that balloon hovered over there for hours before it moved on, before the winds blew it over. So they had a greater chance to intercept things. Now, the problem for them is that the Americans knew they were there. And so, one of the first things that goes out is the general says, nobody talk over the radio. Plus, if you know that the system is overhead and that it's gathering information, you can feed it false information. You can send up false signals or misleading communications, or you can jam it or do things like that. So I think that that's probably what they were trying to do. I think they may have assumed that we would not spot it on radar, because things that operate above 60,000 feet are really hard to spot on radar. But I think that the Chinese were they may have blundered, they may have made a mistake, they may have never expected that that balloon to fly over the central United States. So there's still a lot of unknowns here, but I think it was probably up there to collect communications.
I think what's interesting with the balloons is, we kind of poo-poo the media and laugh a little bit about how crude, stone knives and bear skins, utilizing technology. I mean, I read even on one commentary, maybe the balloon was made out of silk. But I think also the technology has evolved to the point where we have lightweight batteries, for example, that allow energy storage systems. It's clear that, the system that they shot down had solar panels on it. I've been impressed with the maneuverability of it, that they're able to actually direct this thing so that it can hover over a region for a while. But that being said, do you think that this balloon technology, how they relay that information back to China, is it via satellite? Do they then upload whatever information that they're getting to some satellite system that then transmits it back to, to China? And can all of that be intercepted as well by, our technology?
Yeah, it almost certainly was redirected up to a satellite. I doubt that they planned on recording everything and then recovering it at some other stage. There's lots of risks to that. I would caution. I've read a lot of articles about that, and about that incident, and there's a lot of speculation. And I would just caution everybody to be really wary until we get. The U.S. government released some information yesterday, but until we get something more authoritative, there's a lot of people guessing on things. One of the government has said that it apparently had a propeller, so it had some kind of guidance and propulsion system, but I don't think it couldn't be sent somewhere. It could just be steered. So think of it kind of like a sailboat that you can direct into the wind, but you can't decide to go 90 degrees in the other, or turn around or stay in one location. It's going to go where the wind takes it. You can just kind of direct it left or right in the wind direction, maybe. There are some advantages, but I think it's still a pretty limited system in terms of capabilities.
Another question we have is, when countries become aware of surveillance systems like Corona and Gambit, do they ever try to trick them? Could decoys be put out?
Yes, they did try to trick them occasionally, but it is also difficult to do that. There is in some of the declassified documents that the U.S. government has released, occasionally you'll see an intelligence analyst say, we're kind of surprised they didn't cover this up. They could have covered things up. And there's some good examples, for instance, from the 1960s, where the Soviet Union started to construct underground missile silos. And the smart thing to do would have been to dig a hole and then build a tent over that hole and cover, obscure all the activities that were going into the actual construction. And they never did that. And so there are reports that the U.S. compiled where they could determine how thick the concrete was in the ICBM silo. And that gives you a sense of how easy it is to target and destroy that silo with a nuclear weapon. You know, you don't need to be within 100 feet. You could be, you know, half a mile away and still break that concrete, for instance. So there were some things that there were indications later on by the 1970s that the Soviet Union in particular tried to conceal things. And the first thing you want to, the easiest thing to do is to not conduct your activities when a satellite is flying over. Now, the problem with that is you can't hide an army. If you're going to invade Western Europe, it's going to be hundreds of tanks and tens of thousands of soldiers, and that becomes really obvious. And you can't just hide them all under trees. But for things like testing a new aircraft or whatever, you keep it in the hangar until the satellite flies over, and then you take it out and do your test flight. So there is some of that. They also did occasionally try to use things like camouflage netting and concealment techniques, and whether or not they were successful, that kind of stuff is still classified by the US government. We don't want to tell people what we've been able to discern, you know, what works and what doesn't work. And of course, it's always a moving target too. So these things are always shifting. So deception techniques that might have worked 30 or 40 years ago may no longer be effective, because that satellite might have an infrared detection system on it that, you know, visibly something might be covered with a net, but you fly overhead and you see that it's a little warmer than the surrounding grass, and so you know that something's there.
Interesting. On the balloon, the Chinese balloons, you mentioned that the altitude that they're at would be too high for radar, but you also showed a lot of the capabilities of commercial satellite imagery and so forth. I'm assuming these could be tracked quite easily via satellite because they're big, right? And do you think that's, you know, that's something where they were able to spot their paths because they're huge?
Yeah, I'm not so sure, because the satellite, for one thing, has to be taking a picture where the thing is.
Mhm.
And I kind of doubt that there's much interest in taking pictures of, there's much interest, say, in US satellites taking pictures of Montana, because there's not much out in Montana except mountains and fields. So I don't think that that's a very effective way of tracking things. They should be, you know, there are clouds that go up above 60,000 feet, I believe, but I'm not sure that that's an effective way of tracking things. And also, these imaging satellites, they're in low Earth orbit, so they're not overhead for very long, and they don't have very wide fields of view. So you might fly overhead and take images, but the balloon, if there's a balloon there, it might be 10 miles away and you never get a picture of it. So I don't think that that's a way to track them.
Okay, I think that's it. We're approaching 4 o'clock here, just a couple of minutes. I want to thank you very much, Dwayne, as always, for speaking. And I want to remind everyone else that we do still have some things going on yet this afternoon. We have our workshop at 4:30. We have actually 3 of them. So if you get a chance, you can come on down to the Loosemore Auditorium at the Pew campus of Grand Valley downtown to participate in that. That's from 4:30 to 5:30. Then there's a social time, basically from 5:30 to 6:30, where we've got food, delicious brownies and beverages that you're more than welcome to participate in from 5:30 to 6:30. And then also to take in our Design That entries, which I helped set up this morning. We've got a record number of entries from students in grades 4th, 5th, and 6th throughout the region here. We have basically more this time than we've had in the previous 6 years of our Roger That. They're very impressive. So if you can get a chance, come on down and see those this evening as well and munch on some goodies. Stick around then at 6:30. We have our astronaut, Jose Hernandez, who is going to come and speak from 6:30 to 7:30. He will stick around afterwards to sign some autographs, and you can get your picture taken with him, especially the kids, to see him. And that will kind of round out our day of activities for Roger That today. And then if you can come back tomorrow to the Public Museum, or the Public Museum, our partners in our Roger That program, have a lot of things going on during the day that you can participate in. And if you're a resident of Kent County, the kids, if you're 17 and under, are free, so you don't have to pay. Your parents or guardians, whoever's bringing you there, will have to pay, but they pay a reduced rate if they're still members of residents of Kent County. So there's planetarium shows and a lot of hands-on activities to kind of round out the second day of our event for Roger That tomorrow. So we encourage you to come then. So with that, I guess we'll sign off, and we've had another very successful time. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, everyone. We'll see you later.
Bye-bye.
Bye.